out of the array of, hundreds and hundreds of stories, only a certain number are going to flow into that mainstream, so they stay regional. In Alaska, because missile defense is happening there, there's a lot of articles that never make it, anywhere else in the country. But useful things in terms of what people can do. One of the other things that we suggested, and it worked for us in Alaska, back when I was working for the school system, I don't care whether it's local government, state government, or federal governments, there's good people in government, and there's inefficient, incompetent people in government, like any other enterprise. The thing about government is they tend to be monopolies, so efficiency tends to, hit a pretty low level, before things get cleaned up. And that's just the nature of monopolies. In government, what I've found is that virtually everything that can occur at a local level is probably the easiest to address, because you can actually look the guy in the eye or the woman in the eye and talk about the issue and maybe get somewhere. The further you go up, the more difficult it is. So our approach was provide information within the United States and Canada to put pressure on governments going up, and then go to Europe, where I hate to say it, but the truth is there's a much higher technical knowledge on the average person's part in science and mathematics, which made these subjects a little more easier to deal with. And the environmental concerns in Europe were at a higher level than the United States and Canada. And likewise, I think the issues of privacy and concerns surrounding privacy and civil liberties is at a little bit higher level in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, because they've experienced enough of the bad news in recent history. Western Europe, of course, you don't have far back to go to reach things that were much more difficult as populations to deal with. So those are big issues in Europe. And our thought was, if we could move it in Europe and get it into the parliaments in Europe and put pressure back on their peers in our Congress and elevate the issue from the bottom up here, eventually we'd see these issues start to play out. It hasn't happened exactly as we had hoped in the United States, although it continues to be worked on. We really dropped HAARP, not in the sense that it was done, but just in the sense that we couldn't preempt the outcome that we were trying to avoid, which was a unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty. We really felt like this was a mistake. I still feel it is a mistake. We should have included our European allies in that whole dialogue and the development of that dialogue, and it would have resulted in something much more stable. As it is, we've unified Russia and China around the theme of missile defense and have subjected ourselves to another arms race, quite frankly, and I think we're seeing the beginnings of today. Sometime mid-winter, according to the Pentagon lawyers, we'll have crossed the line and we'll be in violation unilaterally of that treaty. And that should be pretty disheartening to everyone around the world, because if the United States will do it on one treaty, they'll do it on others. And it's, I strongly, support our forms of government, but I don't support those in leadership at this time who are headed that direction, because I think it counters everything that all of us are concerned about, whether we live in the United States, Canada, or anywhere else around the world. And the things that I hear, like as I've sat and listened to conversations and just talked to people here, are the same things I hear in Europe, the same things I hear in Alaska or in the States, the same basic concerns. Is government out of control? Is government doing things that are against popular opinion? I mean, look around the world. British government changed out their government a few years ago. The Japanese changed out theirs recently. The Germans changed out theirs. France changed out theirs. I mean, just go down the list. What does that demonstrate? Mexico, for how many years, had the same form of government? They finally changed out theirs. I look at the Republican and Democratic Party, in the United States. It's like a friend of mine, Duncan Rhodes, says, left wing, right wing, same bird. You really don't see much difference on the really important issues. And I think it is important, because there's a lot of disagreement on the social issues, but when you look at the economic issues coming out and how they're framed, those differences start to shrink, and the agenda becomes more uniform. And you don't have to look very far to figure out why. I mean, look who's contributing to the campaigns, and it's the same people, whether Republicans or Democrats, doesn't matter. It's money that drives the system, always has driven the system. Unfortunately, as people become more and more disenfranchised, we fail to engage. This kind of a setting, and I know that you folks, that Wes and the others that put this on, had gotten some criticisms for doing this. And it's a sad day when the media cannot recognize the need to have open, free, flowing dialogue. It's that dialogue. And it's that dialogue that invigorates. You know, the way journalists are trained today is it's to kind of give the neutered news, you know, a neutral view, don't take an opinion. You know, back 100 years ago, every city of any size had 2, 3, 4, 5, some of them as many as 10 newspapers in one town. And they all had very strong opinions. And they expressed them vigorously. And what happened is those opinions varied across those mediums. So you did have a counterbalance. You didn't have neutral news. You have activist news reporting. And what did it do? It invigorated the public debate. Great numbers of people actually participated in the voting process, in the political process, because they were invigorated by the possibility of reasonable discussion between reasonable people coming to reasonable conclusions. And you used to be able to go in and verbally beat each other up, and at the end of the day, settle the issue and go have dinner together. You can't do that anymore. Now it's combat, and you live or die by, you know, by it, and it's not unnecessary. You know, people say, well, you know, you need to report as more neutral, and I don't believe that. And we have a very strong opinion. We make our opinion known, and we base it on the facts that we present. Now, you can go and look at those facts, and we make them very easily available. You know, right there as you're reading it, you can see where it came from, and then you can go pull it yourself and look at it. We think that's the way you deal with reporting news. You give the facts, provide the information, and you form an opinion that is based on those facts. You allow other people to form their own. And that's good enough. I mean, other people have used the same material that we've written and tried to use it, you know, to oppose us, and that's fine too. You know, I don't really mind that. In fact, we've tried to get, like when we were involved in HAARP heavily, we tried to get them to engage in political debate, and they'd only debate us once. And they debated us in the state legislature in Alaska in April of I believe it was either 96 or 97. And what happened is Community and Regional Affairs Chairman Jeanette James, we had used one of her letters to the HAARP planners as an example in the book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, to show how the military can mislead. Because what they said in the letter was absolutely dead accurate. But it was like twisted just a bit. So that it didn't give all the information, just gave enough to answer the question without really answering the question. And so what we did is we took their documents and the letter and we dissected it and said, okay, this is what they said, but this is what this paper says they published, this is what this paper says they published, and this is the rest of the story. And Jeanette James got so upset when she read it, and then she asked for the documents and we produced them, and she read those. She called a hearing. She wanted to have 3 hearings in a series. And the first one, okay, we said, okay, great. So we took 2 physicists with me, and we presented our side. Professor Akasofu from the Geophysical Institute, John Heckscher from HAARP, he was the program manager, and then I can't remember the other gentleman's name, he was from Rice University, on the one side. And we were supposed to have this presentation. Now normally, if you've done legislative hearings, the way they roll is each person gets about 5 minutes, and then the committee asks you a few questions, and everybody goes away. Well, we went through all of that, and everybody got their piece done, and they were reading like a script. And we found out later that our senior Senator Stevens had required them to produce their testimony in advance of the hearing because he didn't want it out of control from his perspective. Well, we didn't script ours, you know, we just did what we needed to do, and then after they presented, I asked the chairwoman, I said, look, do you mind if I respond, because there's a lot of misinformation here and I think it needs to be responded to. She said, no, go ahead. So it turned into this like sort of free-flowing debate, and these guys were like very constrained because they didn't know how far they should go. But our objective in the first hearing was to draw them out, to figure out where were they going to place their arguments so that we could bring the next set of experts into the next hearing and preempt them. And the next person that was willing to go with us was Bernard Eastlund, the inventor of the technology. And unfortunately, Jeanette James wasn't permitted to have a second or a third hearing, and that was the only hearing we were able to get in the United States on the subject. After the hearing, Akasofu had attacked us pretty vigorously in the hearing personally, which was, again, it had no place in, for me, you know, every politician that was sitting in the room listening to it could see right through it because it happens to them all the time. If you can't deal with the issue, you deal with the person and you forget the issues. And they know that game because they play it all the time, so they weren't buying it. But our approach is to never walk away from our adversaries, but to walk into them. And so I called, actually I wrote Akasofu a letter, and I got a call back from Professor Kahn, who is on the advisory committee for the Geophysical Institute, for the HAARP program. And we spoke for about an hour, and at the end of the conversation, he said, you know, he goes, sometimes there does need to be people like you that stimulate this kind of debate so that we can have, you know, the information and maybe make decisions that otherwise we wouldn't make because we're specialists and we're narrowly focused. And I said, yeah, that's true. And he goes, why don't we do this? He says, why don't we try and get an open public conference, and let's bring in all the experts, and let's debate this issue with all the requisite disciplines present. And I said, great idea. I said, you mind if I call the program manager for HAARP and suggest that we do this and indicate that it came from you? And he goes, absolutely, please do that. So we made the communication, and the response we got back was, sorry, we're in compliance with the regulation, we're not going to do it. You know, and that, again, you know, there's three legs to this equation. There's the Geophysical Institute, which is providing all the academic support for the program. There's the military, and there's us, the opposition. This would have brought all three of us into a forum where we could have had this kind of dialogue. Each of the experts would have had their opportunity to present and present their papers and present their work, and reasonable conclusions could have been reached. But they refused to have that much scrutiny, citing that they had fallen within the regulations and they weren't going to do it. And they didn't. And our arguments always were they'll stay within the regulations until it doesn't serve them. And it wasn't a year that had passed that they exceeded the thresholds that they were licensed to operate under during an engineering test by accident, and exceeded the power levels and knocked out communications for people in the area. In Alaska, communications is extremely important. When you live in rural Alaska, your lifeline literally is your ability to communicate wirelessly out of your area. And the idea that you would interfere with that, it's a life and death equation. So and it has always been a big concern to the people within the region. How are we doing on time?
You still have an hour.
Okay, great.
Can we take a break?
You guys want to breathe for 5 minutes? All right, let's take a 5-minute break, and whether you're back or not, I'm going to start again. I missed because I got some questions during the break, and that's always good because it reminds me of all the things that I forget along the way.
Okay, hang on.
There we go. But one of the questions came up, and we're going to go back to this issue of manipulation of human behavior. And I want to say some things about that. There is a lot of people out there talking about these subjects now that weren't talking about them a few years ago. There's a lot of people talking about them without producing anything that I would consider credible evidence. We hear from people who suggest that they're victims quite often. In fact, several times a week we'll get inquiries. And this is what I know, that every one of those inquiries, probably every one of those people is suffering from something. What it is, we don't know. Most of those folks that are coming to us, I think, have other problems besides the ones that they think are responsible for what they're experiencing. And they have to do with psychological disorders that they have that are not triggered by the things that they're suggesting. And you know, voices in the head is common schizophrenic symptom. And there are unfortunately a lot of people suffering with that disorder. The thing I want to say also about that is when you think about this technology and you start to really look at the ramifications of it, it can be pretty disconcerting. I mean, the idea that you can manipulate human behavior, emotions at a minimum, and perhaps even more than that, it should be disturbing to everyone in this room because I think it strikes the very core of who we are as human beings and violates the very essence of who we are as human beings. You know, when you think about energy, when you think about the human body, and you think about the kinds of topics that have been touched on today and yesterday, you know, when you think about humans, energy, atoms, molecules, chemicals, and then body, right? From the bottom up. And when you think about Western medicine, it's from the outside in, right? We look at the body, we maybe get a little bit closer, we do a little chemical work, a little blood work, but we kind of stop there. But if you really want to affect the body, you start at the energetic system. You start at the very bottom and you work your way out. It's the essence of acupuncture, as an example, manipulating the energy of the human being. And what's interesting about that, we talked about all of this radio frequency energy and all this energy that's around us today that wasn't around even as little as 100 years ago. Do you remember, did anybody see that special on the Iceman that was on Discovery Channel? A few people. This was really interesting because acupuncture is always associated with the Chinese. And yet, going back about 3,000 years is what they figure is as far back as it would go in China. And yet they find this guy near the border of Germany and Italy who they know was at least 5,000 years old. And as they study this guy, they find all these tattoos on his body, which were really interesting tattoos because they correlated with acupuncture points and meridians.
The guy's alive today?
No, he's dead 5,000 years ago. The Iceman. The Iceman. Okay, but they're analyzing this and they're going, they see all of these, and somebody on the team recognized the acupuncture points because now that knowledge is fairly widespread. And they thought, well, this is odd, why don't we check and see if these tattoos correlate to any disorders that we can find in an autopsy of the Iceman. And they correlated precisely. And now explain that. Now there's 2,000 years of difference, the other end of the world. Now, from my own perspective, looking at that, okay, you have, and all of us that have been involved in the sciences know that when science kind of happens, it sort of springs all over at once, and whoever's first to the patent office wins the race, but doesn't necessarily mean they really won the race. But when you look back, if you think about the same sensation when everything shuts down and the energy's gone, and the power grid shuts down and you feel that relaxed sensation, you're no longer compensating, maybe back before all of this interference, that there was some perception of that subtle energy in a much more obvious way. In other words, now it's like clouded through an opaque wall of energy that surrounds all of us that didn't exist those thousands of years ago, and perhaps members of society that were sensitive to electromagnetic fields could actually visualize them. And so maybe this was more widespread knowledge, and certainly the Iceman confirms it was 2,000 years older than thought, and that it was worldwide and not limited to China. And I bring that up because, again, it goes back to the root of who we are, energy systems. And now what the weapon systems of today and tomorrow are going to affect that part of who we are, the very essence of who we are. The question of ripping through tissue versus ripping through the very essence of your energetic being, that's what the new weapons technologies are about. And that again, from my perspective, is a leap in the wrong direction, and for the wrong reasons. One of the other things that came up during the break was this idea of synthesizing memory. And this is one of the things that Air and Space for the 21st Century talked about, the idea of creating synthetic memory for training purposes, so that you could go in a very short time and get a memory set, or remove a memory set for that matter, to gain some knowledge at a very accelerated rate. And that's interesting. And the interesting part of it is one of the guys that was interviewed for CBC on a segment they did on mind control technologies was running the lab in Russia, in this area specifically. And what he said was that when you use these techniques, that it bypasses the conscious mind, that part of the mind that filters out right and wrong, good and evil, and goes directly into the subconscious. And what this scientist said is it's like a commandment of God, it cannot be resisted. Now, when you think about that, if something were dropped into your subconscious that was in conflict with your general worldview, it would create a conflict, subconscious conflict. That type of conflict between belief systems is the root of most psychosis, is it creates a disconnect, because you have to reconcile the beliefs, and if you can't bring it through the normal filter, you can't make that reconciliation. Why is that important? Well, think about the applications. Now, the military looks at the application for training purposes. And you look at that application and say, well, what is that going to do? Well, eventually it's going to migrate into the private sector, right? Isn't that what usually happens with military technologies over time? Now you have a technology, when you think about public education as an example, and I worked in public education a long time, and you look at that and you say, okay, public education is compulsory. Now, if all of a sudden the capability of transferring knowledge at an accelerated rate, where maybe you could learn a language in a couple of days instead of a couple of years, that's going to become highly desirable by most people if you're going to compete with the rest of the population. But who regulates the curriculum? Who determines what goes in? Who decides what input you get? And who removes the filter that parents have, which is that conscience that you hopefully instill in your kids, those things that are right and wrong and those moral boundaries. And those are removed when information is dropped directly into subconscious. So that's a very important point. It doesn't mean that the tool is bad. It just means that you really have to regulate the user to make sure that if you're using it for your own uses, great. If you're going to impose that on someone else, you better be regulated in terms of what you do. It's no different than any other technology. I mean, it's and I use the example of a hammer. You know, you can build a nice building, whether you can hit someone in the head with it. You know, it depends on the operator, right? The hammer's not bad; it's the person swinging it. And the same is true with these technologies. It's not the technology is neutral in the sense until the person swinging it decides to how to apply it for the right reasons or the wrong ones. When you think about again, looking at sort of where does all this go, and you know, we're going to have probably 40 minutes left, and we're not going to cover nearly anything. I think I've covered, out of 11 chapters of our new book, we've covered one, maybe 1.5 in this couple of hours. The other area that was particularly interesting to me, and I'm going to touch on some of this, is the area of personal privacy. And some of the things that most people are aware of today that maybe weren't aware of a few years ago is the idea that the cell phones that you carry, you know, they don't just track, you know, who you call and when you call, and they also track where you call from. They can actually deduce exactly where you were when you made the call. In fact, Swisscom uses it in conjunction with police investigations for locating the place where a person was each time they made those calls, because that's also tracked in those systems. And it's not such a big deal anymore because data storage is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You can track a lot more information, hold it for a lot longer for just nothing. I mean, it's information, data storage warehouses, data banks holding huge amounts of data for all kinds of commercial reasons is now pretty routine and growing tremendously. The idea of individuals having personal privacy, you know, we used to think our privacy, the big privacy issues sort of began and ended at a threshold of our homes. That is no longer the case. We live in a digital world, and it is a digital world that is the threshold to our privacy today. What happens within each transaction we make, whether it's the discount card at the grocery store, or whatever it is that tracks your individual purchases, at some level that information can be grouped and then used to target, to market, to manipulate. And there's a difference. I mean, there's a book, I don't even think it's in print anymore, it's called Man the Manipulator, and it's really an interesting book because it talks about persuasion versus manipulation and the difference between the two. Persuasion is delivering the information and the facts and having that debate that generates some kind of a response. Manipulation is playing with the facts so they spin the story in the way that you want so you get the results that you look for. Not by argument, by reasonable argument, but by manipulation of the information. The way campaigns are run today, you know, political office. It is. I mean, it's a poll, it's a spin, and it's a regurgitation of whatever it is that they want to puke back at you that they think you want to hear. And that's the fact of the matter. In fact, in the last major election in the United States, we saw what it led to. You had two guys that were, and these were the two best that our country could produce out of the two biggest political parties. It's kind of embarrassing. But nonetheless, you know, these were the two guys that got to play the game. And they were so focused on the center, right? The pole, the spin, and hitting the center. Man, did they hit the center. They hit the center so much they're both a couple of losers because no matter who won, they both lost. They couldn't get that major percentage of the vote that really, they didn't invigorate anybody. All they did is manipulate everyone into a race, and then they almost manipulated themselves into a war over it. You know, it's pretty ridiculous. But when you look at persuasion, and again, this is the difference. When you look at material that's asking you to change your opinion, your views, or your perspectives, and they produce no evidence, and they're striking you emotionally. Generally, they're using fear. Fear is a great motivator. Go to any good Baptist church on a Sunday morning, and you'll get a good rash of it. You know, but think about it. It's an extrinsic motivator from the outside in. Throw fear at someone. They'll hold it for a couple of days. They'll go back to sinning on Tuesday. You might make it through Monday, because fear doesn't really work. In fact, it's a cheap way out. I mean, if you can't persuade someone that you're right, then chances are you're probably wrong, or at least you haven't convinced yourself you're right either, so you ought to go find a new line of work. Because persuasion has to do with delivery of information that allows people to argue, debate, and that actually expands everyone's knowledge to a degree where maybe you'll actually reach a solution. The solutions are really what it's about. One of those solutions that we posed in Alaska, and it was in a local environment. I started to tell this story and drifted off somewhere else, and it was the idea whistleblower mechanisms, which, we argued that we needed two things. That we needed first an ombudsman, an independent person that had subpoena power that you could go to either as a citizen or an employee and say, hey, I see this thing happening and I want you to go investigate it, and they would go do it. And we actually got that put in place in our school system there. It was very effective and still exists today. The other thing we asked for was a whistleblower mechanism where you could go before any public body, express any issue of public concern, and if anybody retaliated against you, it was treble damages. And that passed our legislature and protected everyone in school systems, cities, municipalities, boroughs, we don't have counties there, and in state government, to give people a chance to come forward, tell the truth, and be heard. A really excellent example, in my view, of that is what happened in South Africa after apartheid, where they said, look, we just want to know what the truth was, because sometimes it's better to know the truth than to penalize the villain. And they said basically, look, come forward, tell the truth, and we'll forgive it, which is forgiveness, one of the highest human qualities and human values, I think, that exists. The idea that we have the capacity to do that. But it's more important to reach the truth, forgive the event, and then those that didn't come forward, they get prosecuted. When the truth comes out and they were hiding in the closet, they were the cockroach in the corner. But that's, in this country, Canada and the United States, I think both governments need it. I mean, I read some articles about what's going on in Canada a few years ago about the government spying on each other, I mean, it's like, come on, you guys, you're lying and cheating the rest of us, you're lying and cheating yourselves too, it's got to end sometime. And the way it ends is by disclosure and the truth. And although it might be uncomfortable to hear it, it's necessary to hear it. And I think once that day arrives, and it has to arrive soon, I mean, we need those mechanisms now because many of the people involved in these programs are dying. They're getting old. They're not going to be here much longer. There needs to be a way to reach in, see the truth, forgive the villains, give them a chance to at least redeem their own conscience before they leave this planet, and to give us a chance to reform our systems that are really corrupted, not because of the people they represent, you and I, but because of the bureaucracies that they've become, where they fuel themselves. People blame the politician, and you're really hitting not quite the right target, because politicians come and go. Any of you have ever worked in government, in bureaucracies, a standard line you'll hear is, don't worry, he'll be gone in the next term. Or if it's a school district superintendent, he'll be gone in the next term, school board will be changed. But the bureaucracy keeps doing whatever they're doing. And they don't, they just are a little quieter about it. They don't stop, they just don't talk about it. They don't ask for funding for that project, they ask for funding for this project and put the money wherever they want. Because no one's looking at them that close. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. It has to do with accountability within bureaucracies and doing something. I mean, it's easy to criticize government, and when we do, we go in and we criticize government or the government employee, and it's easy to do because there's a lot of them that deserve it, but there's a lot of them that don't. One of the things that I suggest to people is a simple thing to do. When somebody in government service, whether it's local, provincial, or national, and you have someone that interacts with you on whatever level, whether it's in a driver's license bureau or somewhere else that deals with you legitimately and decently, don't call their boss, call their boss's boss and tell them so. Because those are the people you want to move forward past their supervisor in the positions of power within those bureaucracies, because they're the people that are doing things and recognize their role in public service. Normally, no one gets the pat on the back. They just get the kick in the butt. And there's a time when you have to do that. And I've heard a lot about putting the good things out there. That's a very simple thing that you can do. And the reason I say bounce it above the supervisor already knows it. If the person's still in a subordinated position, chances are the supervisor doesn't share those same qualities or values. So bounce it up and let people know. It's a good thing to do, and it makes a difference. In the long run, you hope those folks are the ones that evolve into the decisions where when the ethical lines are breached, they breach the right way and come back and tell the world about what's going on. It doesn't happen very often. It happens occasionally. Remember a few years ago in Switzerland, the guy in the bottom of the bank wouldn't shred those documents? And it led to, I don't know how many billions of dollars paid out to people that money was basically robbed from them. And it was a bank clerk. He had no mechanism. He was threatened. He was afraid. He came to this country and people supported him. There needs to be a formal mechanism that allows people at all levels of either government or corporations to come forward, tell the truth, and get some level of protection while that truth is being looked at and investigated and disclosed. And it shouldn't just apply or be limited to government, because the way they sidestep a lot of this is through corporate structures. Under the Freedom of Information Act of the United States, things that are exempt, private communications between companies are exempt, non-published documents are exempt. And how do you get a non-published document? This is interesting. We had a memorandum we ran across, Memorandum 195 in the HAARP project. Memorandums, right? A couple pages, right? Bureaucracy. 613 pages long. Great big memorandum. Well, technical memorandums are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act because they're non-published, although this one was, I think there was over 150 copies made and distributed on our dollar, on our tax dollar, and yet it was a non-published document. We got a copy of it, and CBC used it when they sideswiped the project manager who didn't know they had it. And the guy was sitting there with the interview, and he's very relaxed. And when he got asked a question about this memorandum, you know how when you cross your legs and you can kind of twist, I can't do it, but you can twist them around, so, you know? And he just folded up into a little pretzel and sort of sat there in the chair, and he just, I don't know anything about it. Well, he was the guy that distributed the darn thing, you know? I mean, he knew absolutely where it went and who did it and what it was. And what it was the full perimeters of the HAARP program in terms of the optimum values they wanted out of it, and how they envisioned it working with various systems in Europe and the United States and Canada. So there's lots of ways to sidestep the issue, and the issue is accountability, honesty in corporate structures and in government, and the only way it can happen is there's got to be mechanisms to protect the average person who is thinking about feeding their kids, feeding their family, taking care of themselves, who does not have the resources. It is a rare person that steps out of the box and starts raising the right flag. And we need to look for mechanisms and opportunities to bring people forward. In those essays I mentioned on political empowerment, they get into a lot of details about how to do some of that. You know, and I've done a fair amount of campaign work in my life. My brothers are much better at it than I am, having done a lot more of it. But there's some very good formulas that you can follow that work still, that get people in public office. And it's something that I don't think we're ready yet to give up on. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about, you know, that they're corrupt, they're no good, and a lot of good people I've seen, including some of my own relatives, as they get into public life, at some point they seem to lose focus, and then they come back into focus, you know, with enough time out of office to realize where they're at and where they came from. But it's a mechanism. I mean, you get caught in this trap, and then they're there, and after a couple of years, they kind of lose focus and lose touch with real people. And the reality is, the things, when I look back at my father's time in politics, he always made it a point to leave the lobbyists wherever they were at the cocktail party and get out and maintain good, solid contact with average folks. The people that used to write in the nastiest letters, he didn't hand them off to someone else. He picked up the phone and called them up. Because he figured whatever it was that they had, they didn't arrive at that decision arbitrarily. You know, they got to their opinion based on a whole series of events or facts that they believed in, and he wanted to know what they were, to check himself, to see maybe I missed something. And then when he got done listening to everything they had to say, he either dissected their arguments and they became his allies, or he modified his position and he became theirs. But that's the way it used to be done. Now it's the lobbyist and the guy giving the $10,000 check that has the lunch, and the constituent gets the 2-second photo op as they walk through the office and are shuffled in and shuffled out. That is not effective government. Effective government meets people where they are, recognizes people for who they are, and accepts them for who they are, and learns from each of us, because we have a great deal to contribute, even if we don't see it. And I think that's the other missing piece in some of this today, and in terms of the solution set. And Ian, where is he here? Is he still around? Okay, he's a great guy. If you guys haven't talked to him, you got to talk to him a little bit. But I was listening to him yesterday, and I was thinking, you know, people underestimate themselves. And everybody in this room has greater potential than anyone you've heard speak today. And it's not a question of if or when or what. It's that basic thing that I said earlier, just taking the first step that's in front of you, and before you know it, you'll look back, and there's a whole trail of steps that you took that you never thought you would take. I can tell you probably most of the speakers that have spoken today, yesterday, last year, the year before, and the year before would all tell you the same thing. Where they are today is not where they expected to be 2, 3, 4 years ago, because it's the way it works. When you're acting on what you know to be right and true, and you're willing to modify your position based on the evidence that you receive at the time, you'll do just fine, and you'll move a lot further, a lot faster, and get a lot more accomplished with a lot less tension in your life. Not that it's tension-free. I mean, we have our moments, I can tell you. The last couple of years have been, I didn't have any gray hair till 2 years ago. Now I'm starting to get it. The last couple of years have been a little bit rough, but we're coming out of it. And the thing that I know in all of it is there's incredible potential. You know, things that I never thought I would do. I'll give you a couple examples. They're a little off topic, but maybe not, because this is a conference about empowerment and waking people up and realizing there's a lot of things that can happen. I had spoken to this group, Globe, who I mentioned, and it was this group of legislators from these 44 governments. And I'd spoken to them, and right after I got done with my presentation, it was on Arctic issues, and it was in Rio +5. It was getting ready for the Kyoto event, and these guys were all kind of doing their last rehash before they went to do whatever that was all about. And I gave my presentation, and at the end, this elderly woman came up, and she said, you know, that was very interesting. She said, she introduced herself, Maria Beckett, and she said, I represent the Orthodox Church in Great Britain, and we trace our roots to the island of Patmos and the revelation of John. I said, well, that's interesting. And she goes, and what you just said is delivered as the apocalypse. And I said, well, some people think so. And she said, well, did you come to this conference? I'd really like you to be there. And I said, well, send me the information. I'll think about it. I think I was telling Wes this story earlier. So a couple months go by, and I get this invitation, and it's from Bartholomew I, who is the first patriarch of the Orthodox Church from Istanbul, and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, an invitation to go to this conference, and it was called Religion, Science, and the Environment. Isn't that interesting? And, you know, at first I looked at it and I thought, you know, and the deal was I had to fly at my expense to Athens, and then from there they took care of the rest, and it was a 12-day deal. And I went, you know, I can't justify 12 days, and I just can't justify the expense, because we're a very small operation. There's 2 of us in the office and my wife, and it's a scramble every day. So I thought, no, I'm going to pass on it. So I passed on it, and I accepted an invitation into Germany to speak, which was a fully sponsored event. And then a couple days later, my wife came to me and we were talking. She goes, you know, I think you did the wrong one. She says, you really needed to do this other one. And I went, well, you know what the odds of them inviting me twice are going to be. You know, I just insulted them. I said, no. The next morning I get up and there's a fax. And they invited me to come back and said they'd cover all of my costs. Oh, this is easy, I'm going. You know? I mean, how do you argue with that? You know, and how the day before, it's pretty good confirmation. So I went, and then I got there, and I get to Athens. They had 2 727s chartered for us. They flew us into Trabzon, Turkey, and stuck us on a ship where we were stuck with each other. There were 400 of us flown in. The heads of most of the major environmental universities in the world, representatives from all the major religious faiths, political groups were represented, NGOs to a certain degree were represented. And I'm looking around, I'm going through the agenda, saying, okay, where am I on this agenda? And I'm not on the agenda. I'm a rapporteur during one of the sessions. What the heck am I doing here, you know? And I talked to Maria. I says, what was the story, Maria? And she goes, hey, I liked what you had to say. You're the kind of person that will fit in this organization of people, because there's a lot of really interesting people. You're going to meet some people that you need to meet. They're going to meet you, and there's some good things that are going to happen. Well, one of the guys stuck on the ship with me was Tom Spencer, the chairman of Foreign Affairs, who I'd gotten to know a little bit, but when you're stuck on a ship together for 12 days, you get to know each other really well. And it was extremely useful in mapping out a strategy which eventually led to the resolutions in the European Parliament. But in that trip, I'm thinking, okay, I don't believe in something for nothing, so what can I give back? Again, trying to think about what I could give back to this group that sponsored me, because it was a very interesting trip. I met some great people. The idea and the theme behind it, which really came through, was that religion and science were really saying the same thing, and that what really was a different set of words to describe observations. And the science see it one way, religious people see it another way, but really they're seeing the same thing from a different perspective. And that was really what came out of that conference. I thought it was pretty interesting. But in that, at the end, I wrote a paper on third world development, economic development in the third world, some ideas and some models that I had. And I sent it back, and the foreign minister for the Patriarchy in Istanbul read it, and he said, you know, he'd invited me to the second conference, which was in the next summer, as a participant. And I went, no, I just can't do it. It was a week long. He read my paper, he called me back, and he said, look, I want you to come as a keynote speaker and deliver this paper. All right, you know, I can do that. I mean, I'll do that. So I'm on the agenda. It's me, Robert Kennedy Jr., a European commissioner, a couple of European commissioners actually, and then someone from the Patriarchy, and we're the speakers. So we do our thing, and then we go into work groups, and I find out I'm on the steering committee, which they didn't tell me when I was coming over. So there's 8 of us on this committee. I ended up chairing one of the 3 working groups. And in the end, I was moderating the plenary session where everybody gets to fight with each other to decide what the outcome is going to be. And actually, we did have a fight. It was really interesting. You know, religious people on one side and business people and scientists, and you know, that mix you expect a little bit of fireworks, and we didn't have it. It's really interesting. And when I got there, the first day, I'm sitting in the front row, and they're having the big press conference, and the one woman comes to read the message, you know, from the Pope, and it's this big, drawn-out thing, and the Turkish president's message, and I'm sitting there, and the guy comes up and he taps me, the foreign minister, and he says, "Hey, I want you to read something." And I go, "Now? Here?" You know, and this is it. You know, don't wear suits. This is about as good as it gets. And I'm sitting there, and I go, "Yeah, can't you ask somebody else?" You know, and he goes, "No, you need to do it." So I get up, and he hands me this piece of paper, and I look at it, and it's a message from the President of the United States, Bill Clinton. And it was during the Lewinsky controversy, and I kept thinking of all these great jokes, you know, and I just knew I couldn't say them. But it was like, okay, I can do this. It's not about this guy who I really didn't care much for. It's about the office. So I read it right after I get over the fear of thinking I'm going to run into a Turkish name I'm never going to be able to pronounce. And there weren't any in it, thank God. So I deliver the message, and afterwards I asked, why did you have me do that? He goes, "You'll figure it out." And it was over. And it was the whole issue. He wanted me to moderate that plenary session at the end. He knew he needed to instill a little bit of credibility. He felt that would do the job. So I write the paper, and I circulate it. In fact, you'll find it on my website. I think it's called East versus West, but it's in that political array. And one of my friends in Alaska reads it. And he's the chief of Chickaloon Village, which is a federally recognized indigenous tribe in Alaska. And he said, "You know, this is really interesting stuff." He goes, "I'd like to try it in our village, in our tribe. Would you be interested in working with us on this?" And I wanted a model, a place to try it, because it's an exportable model. It's based upon local control of issues and having them move out rather than imposed from outside, which I think is the root of a lot of the problems in the third world, is external values imposed upon people versus internal values expressed outward, which is, I think, the more appropriate form of